Well, hello, everyone. This is Marianela Medrano from Palabra Counseling and Training Center. This is our third conversation with colleagues who are invested in advancing mental wellness and racial justice out there in the world. And today I have two colleagues. One goes way back in time, and another one is like fresh. I met her last year?
3 years ago?
Yes. Yeah. So the first person we have here is Reese Palmer. He is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and he's also the founder of Palmer Counseling and Consulting. He has expertise in family relationship issues and many other things, because I know Reese has also a background on substance counseling and drug and alcohol counseling, and also expertise in managing and directing good mental wellness, mental health program.
Yes.
He is now in South Carolina. And then Akeera Peterkin. Did I say it right?
Peterkin.
Peterkin. I put an S there.
It's okay.
She is an activist, and I can attest to that. And you're gonna see that the moment she starts talking. So she's both an activist and a psychotherapist in private practice, and also work at Purchase College in the counseling center. She is also my heroine, because she has license in the three-state area. So New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York. So she's also the founder of Amania Nia Therapeutic Services. And she told me that Amani means peace and Nia means purpose. So thank you so much to the two of you for being here with me in this third conversation about racial justice and mental wellness. And the reason I pause is because we're lacking both. So I'm trying to be positive and point the direction in which we want to go. But the reality is that these conversations came about because of the lack of the racial injustice that we're seeing out there, and that we have seen through the past of history. And then how mental wellness is a luxury these days. So my first question is, given that mental wellness is an individual endeavor, right? Like we have to individually, at the individual level, procure work to achieve mental wellness. And then racial justice is this collective thing that involves history and politics and everything in between. But that there is no racial justice without equality and fairness. And that touches both. So my question is, what are some ways in which you see mental wellness and racial justice interfacing in the work that you do? Like, how do you, what are you doing to keep both of them in balance?
Sure.
Right. Yeah. It's up to you. Reese, do you want to go first? Do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, Akeera, and I'll follow.
Okay, all right. Thanks again for inviting me to this conversation. As you know, I'm very passionate about these things. So I get really worked up and excited. But for me, I think the two are always intertwined, right? For me, when I look at mental wellness, right, in regards to people of color, I think we have to think in the lens of racial justice, right? I think it's a disservice if we're trying to make someone or support someone through their wellness journey if we're not recognizing their identity and their experiences. And so for me, when I think of helping a person of color or any other marginalized community become mentally well, I think of the justice behind it, right? And being aware of how society and how I think of it as a public health spectrum, right? And so in regards to when it comes to the individual levels, I want to consider the research and the narratives behind how racism and discrimination impacts the individual and their ability to become mentally well. So for me, I do it at the same time. And for me, in my practice, I look at identity and trauma as within the same lens. So I think you can't get you can't have mental wellness if you're not helping progress in racial justice.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry, were you going to say something first, Marianella? I was going to jump in, but.
No, I want to hear from you. And then there is something that Akeera said that I will come back to, but I'm dying to hear what you have to say. So
yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I once again also thank you for allowing me to be a part of this, inviting me to be a part of this very important discussion. Just to add to what Akeera said, I see that racial equality, racial justice, and equity being directly linked to people of color's mental wellness and mental health. It's very difficult for me to separate the two when I'm looking at someone often who looks like me, right? And so I have a lot of the same experiences when I'm in the room with that person. And so I always want to look at, constructs of power and the different experiences that this person has uniquely gone through. And I always want to make sure that I don't necessarily assume that they're okay. And that because they may be on the outside well-adjusted, they're raising a family, they have a good career, assume that everything is okay. And that the presenting issue is the only presenting issue, right? So I'm always looking at, what are the experiences with trauma? What are the experiences with oppression and marginalization? And I'm always looking at, how this person has been able to cope with these various barriers that are intrinsic to our society and have been for a very, very long time, and how those things play out a lot of times in the workplace, in relationships. And so I'm always looking at them as very, very closely tied. So
yeah, that makes so much sense. And there are two things now that I want to go back to. I think, Akeera, you were talking about how you work with the narrative, and you and I met through the world of poetry therapy. So that's something that I know we pay special attention, and that we specialize in looking at the narrative and kind of deconstructing the narrative to help people find what's underlying that might be keeping them behind or stagnant in one point in their life. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more, and then Reese, I would like to hear more also about the work that you do in terms of changing the narrative, how you help individuals change the narrative. And you both spoke about identity and trauma as two things in a continuum. So we can't really separate one for the other. So knowing that, tell me a little bit about how you work with helping individuals first see the narrative that is there, and then bringing it to, or giving the transformation, whatever the transformation is that narrative needs.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I always love hearing the story, right? I think that's what attracts me to therapy, probably more than anything else. I love hearing people's stories.
Mhm.
And so, when I do my assessment and my intake with them, and I really, really spend a long time understanding their background and their story. And obviously, from a family systemic approach, I'm always looking at
Right.
genograms, and I'm looking at relationships in that family of origin. I'm looking at past generations, looking for patterns, who they're connected to, all those types of things from their ancestry. And I'm always very, very interested in seeing what things have been passed down and what has been that narrative, because a lot of times the narrative, right, has been inherited. It's not necessarily something that's been created wholly of their own, right? So a lot of times it's passed on. And unfortunately, sometimes it's not always the healthiest narrative, right? It's not always the healthiest view of self that's been passed down, whether it be women who are have received this message through the generations that there's this sort of limited role or place that you can play, and you can only go up to this particular place, and you're not really able to do other things that you may have in your mind and your heart, that this is really what you're interested to do. And also with men, a lot of times I think with men, the idea specifically around emotions and vulnerability, sort of the identity and the story that you're told is you have to be strong at all cost and be respected at all cost. And so this idea that there's a lot of times this disowned part of us that we really never even have the opportunity to be fully expressed. And oftentimes that's causing a lot of the dis-ease, is we just are not really fully connecting with all aspects of our being. And so I think it's very important to have that. And so it's a narrative approach that I use. And then in cognitive behavioral therapy, the phrase I like to use a lot is, well, what's the story that you tell yourself in these situations? Like, what's that? I want to hear that inner dialogue. And a lot of times, it's been so much a part of them and integrated into their view of themselves and their worldview that they really never stop to kind of parse it out and really think about, where do all of these thoughts come from? And so we open it up and say, let's be more expansive, and really, does this connect with how you really see yourself and how it feels inside? Or does it feels like there's some cognitive dissonance, like things aren't quite lining up for you?
Right.
And so we also do a lot of work with value identification, and what are some of your core convictions? What's really, really important to you? So I'm a really big proponent of taking the good from our family stories and leaving those that don't fit for us. So that's a little bit of how I approach working with folks.
Yeah, sounds like a working dynamic there that you have.
Absolutely.
Right. And I can totally relate to what you were saying in regards to the narrative really formulating, right, the treatment plan in a sense, right? For me, I work more from a traumatic lens, right? And I am big on not pathologizing my clients. I am big on not necessarily what's wrong with someone. I want to know what happened to someone, right? I think when we go into it as a lens of something's wrong with someone, then we look from a perspective of that power dynamic that we are here to fix them, versus if we look at it from what happened with someone, I look at it as, I'm here to support you through your healing process, right? Yeah. And so when we're thinking about the narrative in behind that, I want to know what happened to you to help heal you in your present time, to now recreate your future story, right? And that's kind of how I work with the narrative in regards to the individual level. On the systemic approach, kind of similar to what you're saying, thinking about the generations. And when we think about people of color, right, that generational trauma coming on from post-traumatic slave syndrome, right, being brought on, right, and the things that we still carrying that our ancestors, right. When I think about what's going on right now, I'm not just seeing individuals grieving, I'm seeing individuals grieving for themselves and the generations before them, and those 400 years of oppression, right? And so thinking about the story that was told, right, and that narrative that society have, the internalized racism, for example, right, that narrative that the society have, in a sense, brainwashed the individual to believe and to think And for me, it's like, now how do we parse that out? How do we pull that out, right? And I'm big on systems as well, right? And but for me, I also do the internal family systems approach,
Yeah.
right? Like, what? Tell me about that 9-year-old self, all right? And how can the 25 or 30-year-old self bear witness to the 9-year-old self? Just bring 9-year-old self along on this journey as well. So I think the story is very essential, and as a storyteller and a story writer, it's also what grabs me and pulls me into the field as well.
Yeah, and what I'm thinking along those lines, I'm thinking, you know, what Angela Davis recently in an interview said that something that, I mean, we know it, but it just, she puts it so well, that racism has been embedded in the fabric and the consciousness of this country. And so that has a repercussion in the generation. So what we're seeing, and I think, you know, both of you are pointing to the importance of paying attention to the trauma, not because we want to capitalize in the story, but because we want people to tease apart the cognitions that come from that, the ideas about the self, the internalized sense of deficiency. And I must say that I'm seeing that more than ever since COVID-19, and then since the political pandemic that has been attacking us, that the sense of who people are, the internalized sense of deficit has increased, right? So I think that two of you seem to be describing ways in which you are going to the, I think you call it constructs of power, you said, Reese, and kind of like taking things apart, as Akeera was saying. Then what happened though? My second question, I think, touches in what we're saying now, the psychological impact of disadvantage and discrimination, and, you know, how do they impact? Do you see a difference between men, women, LGBTQ community? What are you seeing in working with people? How is the, you know, this discrimination and marginalization impacting people? Are you seeing differences depending on the vantage point or the persona that someone walks the world in? Or what are you seeing with that?
Right.
Yeah. You want to go first, Akeera?
Sure. Well, when you said, what are you seeing with that? I just thought about something I've heard in the past, is the colorblind system, right? Where we say we don't see individuals, right? Then if we're not seeing an individual, right, we're not seeing how they see us, right? And so if a white person is disregarding my color, right, they're disregarding my experience that I might be associating with them, right? And all the years of discrimination and oppression that I'm experiencing with that individual. But that being said, in regards of the different communities and how discrimination impacts their mental wellness, I don't think it's at the same levels, right? I think if we thought it was at the same levels, then we're ignoring intersectionality, right? And I think the more identities one has in marginalized systems, the more likely they are to experience higher levels of discrimination, right? And higher levels of distress. Right? And so for me, I don't want to look at a Black trans woman and their experience or her experience as the same as a Black cis man, right? Because the Black trans woman is going to experience all the things as a Black woman, right? And then a Black trans individual, right? And then as a trans individual as well. And so I don't think it's fair to treat all of them as the same when we have to recognize that every one of those communities comes with their own experience and disadvantages and discrimination and oppression and violence as well, right? I think when you think about the Black trans, they're dying on a daily basis, and we're not talking about that in society, right? And so what are we telling the Black trans woman, that their life doesn't matter, right? And so for me, I don't want to treat that the same as I may treat a Black cis male who has some privilege, right? But I'm not going to disregard the Black cis male's experience as well, because he also has his own stuff that he's going through as an individual too. So I think for me, intersectionality is very important for me to keep in mind.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Akeera said. I think that, when we look at this from just sort of a institutionalized racism as sort of the umbrella, then you've got these sub populations and subcultures, and there's different pockets and different experiences of marginalization. And so I think it's really, really understand what's unique about that particular individual, because, even, as a Black woman or a Black man who may have grown up in a very similar type of family of origin environment, or even geographically, may have profoundly different experiences. And so being able to really understand that people's stories, even though they may look alike, may come from similar family of origins, similar parts of the country, have very, very different experiences and different stories. And so it's really about, just being curious and really wanting to know what it is that this particular person, has been told. What are the messages that has been given to them by, first of all, the white male dominant society. And then unfortunately, a lot of time of that internalized racism and colorism and all kinds of, additional layers of oppression within the community of people of color just makes it even more complex to navigate all those things, right? So we really have to understand exactly what that person's experiencing. And so I think for me, the most important thing is creating a safe environment to really explore these things, because a lot of times, particularly, for people of color, I think about Dr. Ken Hardy. I don't know if you guys have heard of Ken Hardy. He's a marriage and family therapist, and was originally at Syracuse, and then I think he was at Drexel for a while. I'm not sure exactly if he's still on faculty anywhere, but his whole talk that he does on the assaulted sense of self is just amazing, because it's this idea that your sense of yourself does not come from within yourself. You're identified from the power structure. And so, the sense of you get defined not by yourself, but by someone outside of yourself. And so you spend so many years of your life trying to unpack all of this junk, I'll just call it that has been heaped on you, and struggle to really find your own identity. And I think a lot of mental health, anxiety, depression, all of those things come from this struggle to really just be able to have your voice and to construct your own identity. And so it really, strikes me so much when I have these conversations that folks are really just trying to figure out who they are without having this sort of this label or this this category or whatever you want to call it thrust upon them. And so it just kind of perpetuates the same sense of powerlessness. And so in the session, kind of some of those feminist approaches and talk about power dynamics and helping people to gain their voice back, to really be able to say, okay, but it's your life. Okay.
Right.
What do you want to be? Who are you? What's important to you? Let's start there and begin to recreate a new narrative, right? And so that's the piece that's, to me, the most worthwhile part of doing the work, is actually helping people to become who they are, who they were meant to be, and living the best version of themselves, being authentic, showing up in the world, in their relationships, in their family, in the workplace.
Yeah, and you know what I'm thinking? One of the things that I'm very grateful for the work that the Stone Center has done in Massachusetts is the really clarifying the attention that we have to have when we have someone in front of us. One of the concepts that they highlight the most is this idea of a social esteem, not so much to talk about self-esteem, but a social esteem. And I think if we put individuals, the individuals that we're talking about here primarily, who had been under the thumb of history, under the knee of injustice, to just bring it to a closer thing, that has had an impact on the social esteem, how people perceive themselves. And, you know, that, then I want to segue with that to my next question, which is, I mean, it's all interrelated, but we have the long history of racism that I was talking about before when I mentioned Angela Davis. That has impacted the maintenance of illness. We're talking about wellness, right? We want to focus on mental wellness, but we know there is a system that has maintained the sickness. And it's a system that has attacked primarily people of color. And so for us, immigrants, and so what are some ways in which you think, you know, I just pointed to some, but from your experience working with diverse population, what are some of the ways in which racism and all the maladies, the negativity that comes with it has been sustained in this country?
Right. I mean, I think the system was built a certain way, right? And the system is working for the ones that it was built to work for. And so I think if we're thinking about the way the system is built, I think it's naturally sustaining the mental illnesses of what people of color are experiencing, right? And so to me, I think on the individual level, I think the system has unfortunately led to communities becoming more and more ill, right? But I think I kind of also want to touch on our system of the mental health, right? And how it's in some ways kind of also partaking in that system, right?
That's where I want you to
go.
go.
of white supremacy. And for me, I think I think it's important for us to recognize our own system of mental health and how the systems of bias and oppression has been intertwined, right? If you think of the long history, I think it's ridiculous that it was once considered a disorder for slaves who wanted to be free, right? That was once a mental health disorder, right? I think it's also, I think still to this day, Black and brown people and women, right, are being disproportionately diagnosed with severe mental health disorders, right? And what is that message saying to individuals, right? It's like, I think we're coming from a lens of not understanding people as one, but I think we're also coming from a lens of bias and really entrenched bias, right? And so I think in that notion, we're doing a disservice for people of color because there's obviously and rightfully so a sense of distrust with our institution of mental health, right? And then I think on the other lens of that is in regards to the communities, when it comes to our own mental health system, is look who holds the majority, right? Majority of white men or white people, right? And so in regards to that, there's not much diversity there. So I think the system has in some ways failed the community when you're not really looking at the lens of, there's already a power dynamic that you were talking about, right? That's in place when you bring a person of color into a room with a white person, right? And so I think the system has repeatedly failed people of color, but then it makes you wonder, who was the system built to help? And I think it was built to help white middle class and upper class white people, and not really looking at people of color and other communities as well.
Yeah. And I think to kind of just piggyback on what you just said, Akeera, I think there's also an ongoing sort of disavowal of the ongoing impact of slavery on us many, many generations later, right? And how that still continues to have these far-reaching, very traumatic impacts on the way that we see ourselves. And so I think that for me, the things that are very difficult and very frustrating is that a lot of times things that are pathologized in people of color are really responses to the system that we have learned to survive in, right? And so a lot of our behaviors and a lot of our movement in this world is really about survival, right? And it's about, you know, not so much thriving, but surviving and understanding how to survive within the context of this system. And so I think it's very, very difficult for someone of color who's already kind of living under this the stigma of being a person of color, right? To now be potentially once again defined as someone as less than, because now you have a mental health diagnosis, right? And so it's interesting. I want to bring up something that Dr. Ken Hardy said once, that, you know, as a Black man, you know, I could potentially meet the clinical criteria for paranoia. And he said, but that paranoia is a healthy paranoia. And he said, I'll keep my paranoia as a Black man, if that's okay, because it, you know, it's a necessary requirement as a person of color in this system. There's a certain healthy level of paranoia, right? When you're as a Black. Absolutely. And without that, you know, without that sense of awareness of being, I guess, I hate using this word, woke, understanding really what's happening, that you really could be in significant, a disadvantage of not really knowing kind of the space that you're moving in. And a lot of these things are very, again, subtle, microaggressions, and not being aware of those things. You know, you could constantly find yourself being frustrated, not knowing what's going on and why things seem to feel so heavy and burdensome. And so, again, I think it's so important for us as clinicians to really, as Akeera said, understand that trauma lens and exactly what it is that they're, you know, because we know trauma changes the way the brain sees things, perceives yourself, others. It really informs your worldview. And so we have to understand that at a very, very specific level for each client, and how that's changed the way that they see themselves and see the world. So it's still an amazing, I still feel an amazing honor to be able to even go on this journey with folks where they begin to really unpack the layers, sometimes generations and generations, not just within themselves, the people. That's why I love when the generations come in, like mom comes in and then grandmom comes in, and then, like, I love to, I love it. You know, obviously I'm a systemic oriented clinician, so I love seeing all of that energy in the room. And it's some of the most powerful sessions I've had. You know, one I did was with a minister and his wife, and they're serving overseas as missionaries, and they have I think 8 adult children now. And they were just talking about a lot of the different family dynamics and the struggles they had moving from country to country, and a lot of the things that happened. There was some infidelity there, so there was a lot of shame because, you know, they were a Christian family. And it was just amazing to have the parents, you know, the matriarch and the patriarch in the room, along with all 8 kids. It was amazing, right? To just be able to see everybody's perspective on how this family story got created. And I love how there was 1 or 2 that were really pushing to shift the narrative to be more authentic and be more genuine. And so it's a wonderful honor. And so I love doing this work. And and I hope I get to do it for a very much longer time.
Yeah, and that's the importance of having those multi lenses when
Yes.
we work with people. You know, going back to what the two of you were saying, and the norm, that part of the work that we need to do is to normalize certain things, certain reactions. If someone is telling me that they're not anxious and depressed right now with the state of affairs of the world, then I'm thinking there is something very wrong with that person, right? And that instead of us, and I don't think, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, because you wouldn't be pathologizing anxiety for anyone at this point. But, you know, when we were talking about, you know, who created the system and who is sustaining this system that really does a disservice to people of color, we have to ask ourselves, you know, how is my daily interaction contributing to the maintenance of the wrong views of you know, looking at people when working with them. So the idea of having that multi layer or multi-lens view of them, and also normalizing anxiety, you know, like your colleague, you were citing your colleague about the paranoia. Yeah, there are certain things that we need to normalize. And right now, being anxious and depressed is a very good response to what's happening right now. And what happens, you know, one of my professors used to say, to remind us always that depression was a call to bring things back. It's a disorder that calls us to bring things back into order. So right now we're seeing a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression that's coming because we're saying this is not right. You know, that our brother was killed, you know, for no reason, and not just him, but how many, after George Floyd, how many Black and brown bodies had perished. So we have to see what's causing that, what's sustaining that, and how are we reacting to that? Because it will be, if we all mental health providers make the disclosure, yes, I'm anxious and I'm depressed. That's a good place to start. Do you agree with me?
Yeah, I think that, you know, that there it is it's a healthy acknowledgement of what is, you know. I love Iyanla Van Zant says, you know, call a thing, you know.
Right.
So let's just say what it is. It's a very anxious and very depressed time that we're living in right now. But I believe that from anxiety and depressed is when a lot of changes happen. Social justice has come, you know, from people who are feeling anxious and depressed, and finally saying that we have to make a change. Something has to happen. And so I think that if you're not feeling some level of anxiety and depression or discomfort or dis-ease about what's going on, then not only are you maybe not woke per se, but you're really numbed out to what's going on. And, you know, I understand that a lot of times that is a coping mechanism. We just sort of kind of numb out to everything and kind of, you know, it just becomes too overwhelming. But I think that, you know, as clinicians, we must, I think we bear the burden and the responsibility to be very authentic and genuine. And so that we invite and permit when our clients and our folks come into the room to also be authentic and genuine and not feel like they have to come in and keep the mask on. And, you know, I love that when you know, clients say, "Oh, can I say that? Can I talk about that here? Is that okay?" I'm like, "Yes, that's why you're here. This is the place. If you're not going to talk about it anywhere else, let's talk about it here, right?" So absolutely, I feel like that's our responsibility as clinicians and you know, those who are passionate about this work to make sure that we are very much being authentic and inviting others to do the same when they come to the room.
Right. You know, there's something that you said when it comes to a lot of the social movements that stemmed from anxiety and depression, right?
Yeah.
I also remind my clients that anger, right? The power of anger, right? There wouldn't be any of these movements that these justices that we've attained as a society if people weren't angry, right? And I'm thinking about my own grad school training when it comes to change, right? We are not going to change if we feel comfortable. It's when we're uncomfortable that we're moved, we're compelled to do something different, right?
Right.
And then for the people who are not woke, right, and the people who are maybe not moved by what's going on, I also wonder, there's an aspect of people, yes, numbing out to kind of maintain and sustain the little bit of energy they have, right? But I also think there's also the people who are not woke, right? That maybe they're the ones that the system is privileging, right? They're the ones that working from the society, right? If they're still at this point still can't see what's going on, right? Then I have to wonder, like, are you benefiting from the system that has been in place to help certain people benefit from it too?
Yeah,
right?
that's a really good point, Akeera, and I'm also a little bit anxious when I have these types of conversations, and there doesn't seem to be, you know, a little bit more of an outcry or frustration or some level, and then you do have to begin to ask yourself the question, and then, you know, if it isn't directly impacting you as perhaps maybe other people, then, you know, is it okay for you to be comfortable, for you to be safe, for you to have opportunities, for you to have a voice, and perhaps your kids to have, but others don't, you know? And so that is something that always kind of, you know, I'll be honest, triggers me a little bit when I see that they're okay with the state of affairs, because then it's that same apathy or that same sense of, well, you know, this country is great, it's working for me, and, you know, and then there's sort of this lens that everyone has the same opportunity because everything's working well for me and the system isn't broke. That's a big part of the problem.
Right, yeah.
And what I'm thinking, you know, what do we say to institutions who are serving people of color? Because, you know, we are, you know, in private practice, and we have these centers. The three of us have created places that were created as a response of the awareness we have of what was not right, what was going wrong with the system. Yet the majority of people get services from these big institutions where they are processed, you know, rather fast and in a very sanitized way. So what do you say to, or what are the recommendations for institutions who are serving people of color? How can they get more up to date with the needs that we had discussed here?
Right. Well, I think a part of it is the individuals and the institution has to be ready to look themselves in the mirror, right? And I think if we can't acknowledge certain aspects of ourselves, then we're not able to change those aspects of ourselves, right? And so if the institution is ready to do some of that work, then some of my suggestions, well, three of my suggestions will be like representation, equity, and community, right? And so for me, when I'm thinking about, if you want to serve people of color, be aware of how you're representing people of color or lacking the representation of people of color, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that white people can't do this work, right? But just being the awareness of what your office looks like, what your website looks like, right? Is it just heterosexual white couples, right? And then if I always say, I've been using the analogy that people of color have been walking around with PTSD for so many years, like that, right? And so we're super hyper vigilant. We're always checking our surroundings, right? And so when we're looking at a website or a show, we're picking up on whether or not we see ourselves in those images, right? And so having the representation, I think, is important because it's saying you're welcomed here, right? There's that underlying subtle message of like, you're welcome here, right? And then equity, when we're thinking about the institutions and who it was meant to serve, I'm thinking is the healthcare system in general is meant to serve people with money, right? And for me, my private practice, what I've been doing is I've been making it just equity based. Like, what can you actually afford for therapy? And I recognize that I'm in a privileged state and I can afford to do that, and not everyone is, right? But recognizing not everyone can break out $100 plus for a session, right? And meeting the client where they're at as far as their financial needs can be helpful. And then my last suggestion will be, people of color are really big on community, right? My partner is actually a white woman, and she's always saying that she's jealous of the community that people of color have, right? There's always, she actually says she feels more safe with people of color, right? Because there's always people of color are looking out for each other.
Village.
All right, and so with the community, I think it's like getting to know the community, like walking outside and bringing your services to the streets. So partnering with local community organizations, right, to help them, support them, and asking like, how can I help you, right? Because we don't want to assume you know everything of what this community needs, right? You want it to be an equal partnership. And so I think really getting out there in the community is also essential as well.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah. I think I want to just jump in on the representation at these institutions, because I think that is such an important aspect of doing this right? Because I think almost sort of like it's, you know, cultural sensitivity and these different buzzwords and phrases have become almost cliche. And I guess over the years, I've become a little bit jaded about these sort of cookie cutter approaches in different institutions and corporations and organizations to be more diverse and have more cultural awareness and sensitivity. When I feel like a more organic way of really understanding a community and understanding not only the collective consciousness, but the felt lived experiences of people of color and marginalized groups, is to talk to them and hear their individual stories, you know, kind of like an old African fable book. You just listen to all of these different stories and you get the flavor of this cultural, you know, experience. And so having these individuals have a voice and a place at the table to be, like the military has like subject matter experts, right? They call them SMEs. One of my clients hipped me to that word, that phrase, so I use it all the time now. I love it. So a subject matter expert, right? You know, who can tell you more about being a Black man than me? You know, if you want to know, I'll sit down and I'm happy to share with people who are truly, authentically, and genuinely curious and want to know, so that they can be better informed on how to be more sensitive and how to know how to best reach people and create a safe space with someone who doesn't look like you, right? So I really think that that is a huge part of, you know, so I wanted to just piggyback on what Akeera said, because I think that, you know, these conversations need to be happening more organically. They need to be more genuine and authentic, you know, and you need to be able to feel comfortable enough, right? And kind of move past the white fragility and just say, hey, I really want to hear your story, not because I want to create something from it, or I just really am here to learn. And it takes a great deal of humility, right? But we in the Black culture, we knew that because we always knelt at the elders' feet. We sat at their, you know, at their feet and learned, and that's how we understood and we learned respect. So that's not something that we typically struggle with, is humility, right? Because we know that from just our culture. So I think that that needs to be infused into some of these larger institutions and organizations where it needs to come back to, right? Because when you start talking about these huge political, you know, frameworks and movements, sometimes you can get kind of lost in it. But if I know Akeera's story, right, and her family story, and I know Marianella, and now it's much more intimate, it's personal, because it's not just sort of this vague concept, or what I've seen in media, or I've seen in you know, on television, but I know someone, and I know their story, and I know their parents' story, and their parents' story, and I know that it hits differently when you've had that intimate experience with someone and you've spent time with them. That's what I believe is needed.
Right.
I think so. I mean, I can't agree more about what you both said. with that idea of creating intimacy, of getting to know the other person. I think it truly resonates.
And
Uh,
also, sorry, I was
mhm,
also going to say it also describes the notion of empathy too, right?
Mm,
So like, and isn't that the really the essence of our field is to be
mhm,
able to empathize with individuals, right? And so when we get the personal story, I think we're really empathizing with the individual, and it's not just it's not a other, right? Not the it's not distant. Now it's like you said, it's intimate and it's personal, and now we
yes,
feel compelled to do something differently.
that's
um
right.
the other thing I kind of want to add there, though, is also the idea of representation. I also want to caution and challenge institutions not to have tokens, right? And
yes,
tokenizing individuals,
Yeah.
because
it
I think
gets tiresome.
right, right. And then if you got the one black person or brown person that you go into to get like, tell me what it is that your people are experiencing, right?
Hmm.
That's a lot of heavy lifting for that individual. And also, not every individual, like you mentioned before, not every individual of color has the same experiences, right? And so
Right.
maybe it's bringing the community into having a seat at your table, right? Maybe it's
Hmm.
open having a workshop and having the community teach you,
Hmm.
right? And not necessarily going to your one colleague or your one friend to get the answers.
I agree
Yeah.
with that. And when you have such a rich, diversity of voices from people of color, whether it be, people from, you know, Afro-Cubano or Afro-Latino. I mean, just the different rich
Mhm.
experiences and cultures. I think you really get all the nuances of it. So we have like the collective experience, right? The collective identity. But then there's these little, because as the slave ships dropped us along, we picked up little pieces here and there. And so if you want the whole story, you got to get, because if you want to make the stew, you have to have all the ingredients, right? And so
Yeah.
let's go and hear where all of the ingredients come from and what that experience is like. And then I think that is where the intimacy
Mhm.
comes from. And as you said, Akeera, that's where the empathy comes from, because now I feel compelled that I know you, we've made a connection on a very humanistic level, on a real level, and now I feel compelled to move and do something, because you're not just out there, you're someone that I actually know and I have an intimate connection with.
Yeah. With these interviews, I always feel like, oh, I need part two of this one. But we are at the top of the hour, and I don't want to leave without asking you to share with me and the audience what you are, because I'm thinking since the pandemic, the health pandemic began, we have been working extra hours, and there has been no rest for mental wellness providers.
Yeah.
And then we were hit with, well, it's an ongoing pandemic, but one that really got brought to the light, so no one can ignore it anymore. Right. So our work has more than doubled. So give me just one way in which you are taking care of yourself.
You guys already know.
Yes, that's not fair.
I go to the beach, baby. I have to get next to the water. It's just who I am. And I learned a very, very long time ago that that being near the ocean and being able to see the ocean and horizon meet and see the clouds and feel the sand in my toes, it just grounds me. It brings me back to a place of all is right in the world, and the world is really a good place, right? It's where I feel most connected to God, and it just brings me right back. So even as I'm driving down the highway and I can start to smell the seawater and the ocean and the breeze, my whole vibe just changes,
Yeah.
And so for me, it's really about, at some point disconnecting and saying, okay, I gotta take some time and get to a place. I do a lot of mindfulness work with my clients, and I do a lot of guided imagery and controlled breathing and those things to help with anxiety and PTSD. And I do it a lot with couples. I work mostly with couples, as I said, but, you know, I always remind them, you know, you have to be able to connect with your happy place and your safe place, right? And you are the foundation of your family. And so if the foundation is weak, then the family's going to weak. So you've got to take care of yourself. So my wife and I are co-owners of our practice, right? And so, you know, it's about taking the time and scheduling it. You know, I'm still getting used to this idea of scheduling, you know, time to take care of myself, because I think a lot as people of color, we're getting used to this concept of taking a vacation or taking a break, right? Because we're so used to working, and our work ethic is like crazy, right? So this idea of actually taking time off is still, I think we're getting used to it. It's in my DNA, but now that's my biggest thing. And then I'm a cyclist. I like riding my bike and getting out on the open road and just riding and just, you know, vibing out with just my thoughts and listening to some jazz. I love jazz. So and I love to dance. My wife and I are big dancers, and so we do a lot of salsa, merengue, and we just love learning new line dances. It's just moving the body, you know. So anything that I can do that allows me to listen to some good music and eat some good food and be next to the water, oh gosh.
So you have many ways to get into getting the body to say yes.
Yes, this is it. That's right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's
How
awesome.
about you, Akeera?
I would just like to comment and said where you were like doing the imagery of the ocean. I'm from the Caribbean, so me and my Trini self were just transported back to the islands.
There you go.
Like, yes.
There you go.
But yeah, and I was actually supposed to be in Trinidad right now, but you know, pandemic. But for me, usually I travel, but with the pandemic, that's up in the air. The thing I also like to remind people of color is like the idea of self-care actually came from people of color during like activism movements, and a lot of us don't know that, right? It was a way to preserve ourselves to keep fighting the big fight, right?
Keep the fight, yeah.
Right, and so I mean, I think that has kind of appropriated itself, right, and kind of come to a place where we think of it as you need money to self-care. But for me, I've been remodeling my home, so I purchased a home last fall and using it to paint all 3 floors and kind of get sweaty, going for walks, definitely watching some good Netflix shows and hanging out with my partner. And I've become a fur lady lately. I got 3 cats, so I'm now a power cat woman. And I hang out with my cats. And I actually also do therapy too. So like I have my therapist on call when when this whole like Black Lives Matter thing was having me grieving a little, right? And I check in with my therapist. I think for me, I like to the therapist needs a therapist sometimes. And so for me, that's absolutely my self-care as well. But yeah, so I think, you know, self-care is essential.
Yeah. Well, the 2 of you, I saw how easy it just flew out of you to talk about this. So that's testament of how often you do it. So, and yes, we cannot offer care to anyone unless we take care of ourselves. So
that's right. That's right.
That. And thank you for joining me. And don't be surprised if I call you again to continue the conversation. This I find it very helpful for me, and I know that other providers who are asking themselves these questions also appreciate that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor.